Good morning, everybody. We're continuing our study of the book of Shemuel Aleph. We are up to chapter 26, Perek Vav. We did the lengthy chapter 25, Perek Kafhe, talking about David and Abigail and Nabal. We left just one tiny bit thing hanging at the end of chapter 25, which was Shaul giving his daughter Michal, who is David's wife, over to this man by the name of Palti ben Laish. We noted that the rabbis debated if this was another marriage, that it seems pretty unlikely that Shaul would give a married woman who didn't have any kind of divorce, his daughter to another man. So some people say they watched over each other, or others say that they were divorced, that there was just that matter of how the divorce worked. Nevertheless, I think the key takeaway is that the Tanakh is once again teaching us, Navi is teaching us about a complicated relationship between David and his wife Michal, which we had already noted when they first got married was pretty complicated at the time. Michal is in a similar situation to her brother Yonatan, having to play between the sides of allegiance to her father, the king, versus their allegiance and their loyalty to David. She's married to him, she saves him, but she lies about it, and she doesn't go with him. And there's always this kind of feeling that Michal loves David. David doesn't really love Michal back. We saw that in the text. And again, it seems apparent that David, while he's on the run, is separate from his wife Michal, to the point that Shaul gives her over to somebody else. You can see the tension here in that pasuk when it says V'Shaul Natan et Michal bito Eshet David, right? So she's both called the daughter of Shaul, but the wife of David, expressing the tension between these two sides. But it seems when push comes to shove, she's first referred to as Shaul's daughter before she's referred to as David's wife, maybe because David wanted it that way. He didn't come full circle with Michal. Could be, yes. It definitely seems as though word gets back to Shaul that not only has he taken Abigail, but he also took another woman, Achinoam. So David has multiple wives while he's on the road, and he's left Michal behind. So Shaul has probably picked up on the notion that David is not too enthusiastic about his daughter, and so why should he be too enthusiastic about him either, right? So there's definitely some tension, and like I said, this relationship and this tension continues to build and build to the point where there's a major confrontation between David and Michal. We'll continue to track that progress as we go through the different chapters. We're now ready to begin chapter 26, Perek Vav, which is David and Shaul's final encounter. And as we read this chapter, you're going to notice that it is strikingly similar to chapter 24, which was the last encounter between David and Shaul when they met up in the cave. In fact, as we read the chapter, I'm sure you will see that almost all of the elements that are in chapter 24 repeat themselves in slightly different variations in chapter 26, basically leading us to the question, why is this chapter even important? We basically did this story exactly the same way 2 chapters ago. Why are we even discussing it? But as I noted, and as I have noted many times, parallels often highlight very subtle differences. So as we're reading, we'll note all of the parallels. We'll try to pinpoint where the differences are and hopefully get ourselves to understand why chapter 26, why Perek Vav is important, keeping in mind that this happened after the story of Abigail, and maybe that story kind of taught David to do something a little bit different than what he had done the chapter before, in chapter 24. Let's begin reading the Pesukim. We're up to page 705, if you're in the Sachs Hebrew English Tanakh. We'll read together and translate, and then bring up our points as we go along. The Zifim, who we know them from chapter 24, they were the ones who gave David up the first time in chapter 24. So they're the traitors against David. They come and they tell Shaul, David mistater begiv'at ha'achila al pnei Yeshimon. Behold, David is hiding in the hills of Hachila, facing Yeshimon. You can go and get him there. So obviously, despite, as we noted in chapter 20, at the end of chapter 24, despite Shaul admitting to David that he was correct, they went their separate ways because Shaul still cannot control himself from pursuing David. Verse 2. Shaul gets up and he takes his men down together with him to Midbar Zif. Together with him are 3,000 choicest men in the army of Israel, levakesh et David b'midbar Zif, to seek out David and search for him in the wilderness of Zif. Shaul takes camp in the Giv'ah of Hachilah, the mountain top of Hachilah, Asher al Penei Shimon al Hadarech, which faces the Yeshimon by the road. David Yoshev Bamidbar, David is sitting in the wilderness, camped with his men. Bayar Kibash Shaul Acharav Hamidbara, and he sees that Shaul has come to encounter him in the wilderness. So we've noted time and again, David seems to be a step ahead of Shaul. Every time Shaul makes a move, David already anticipates what he's going to do. He already sees where Shaul's going with it, and he's able to try and dodge Shaul and get around him. In this situation, David sends spies. In verse 4, Vayishlach David meraglim, David sends spies to scout out the camp of Shaul. And he made sure that Shaul had in fact come down. If you remember from chapter 24, when David asked the question to the Urim Tumim, is Shaul going to come? Is he not going to come? He wasn't always sure. David now sends spies. Instead of asking Hashem, he sends spies now to go and scout out whether Shaul has in fact come down to the territory, and he ascertains that it is true. No, not problematic. He takes a different approach slightly. But again, David wants to have knowledge of Shaul's whereabouts. He makes an effort to know where Shaul is. No, he has come around. It's confirmed that he has come. Exactly. Vayakom David vayavo el hamakom asher chan sham Shaul. David gets up and he comes to the place where Shaul is encamped. This time he's not going to avoid Shaul. He's going to go directly at Shaul. David sees the place where Shaul is lying and sleeping. Avner ben Ner sar tzeva'o, a man by the name of Avner, son of Ner, is his chief general. Shaul is sleeping in a circle. And the people, his nation, his army, is encamped around him. So Shaul is at the center. Everyone else is around him to serve as protection. This is standard camping practice, that you have the king in the middle, protected by the outer soldiers. Vayan David vayomer el Ahimelech Hachiti ve'el Abishai ben Tzeruya achi Yoav lemor. David calls out and he says to two men. One is Ahimelech Hachiti. The other is a man by the name of Avishai ben Tzeruya, who is the brother of Yoav ben Tzeruya. And he says to them, Mi yered iti el Shaul el hamachane. Who's going to come with me down to the camp to go and engage Shaul? Vayomer Avishai, mi yered imach. Avishai, amongst the two, says, I will go with you. Now, just to take a pause for a minute, these are two individuals whom we've never seen before. We don't know their names. Correct. This is also the first time we're introduced to Avner ben Ner, the general of Shaul. We did actually read about his name earlier because he was related to somebody. I forget how it was. It was mentioned earlier. I don't remember off the top of my head. We mentioned him as, it'll come to me, but we mentioned him as being related to somebody that Avner was the cousin or something like that. I forget. But Avner is going to be a very important character in Shemuel Bet, as he was Shaul's, he was Shaul, now he's Shaul's chief general. When Shaul dies, he will move over to David's camp and become one of David's members, and there'll be a lot of tension with Avner and some of the other characters in David's group. So that's a name to keep in the back of our minds as well. This is the first encounter between David and Avner. We also find these two men, Ahimelech Hachiti, who we don't know who that is. We know the name Ahimelech HaKohen from previous chapters, but this is somebody different. Yeah, that was Ahimelech HaKohen, was the one from Nov. But this is Ahimelech Hachiti, a different person entirely. And Avishai ben Tzeruya is a new name for us as well. But the text introduces him as the brother of Yoav, which is interesting because we don't know who Yoav is either. But the text is basically setting us up for the fact that these will be very important characters coming up a little bit later. Yoav is going to become David's chief general, in a couple of chapters from now. Yoav ben Tzeruya. I think they're all related to Yishai, David's father, right? That's where I think it comes out. Actually, if we take a peek, let's go back to where David is crowned. I think it is. I think that's in chapter, maybe it's in chapter 14, I forget. See, I'm taking time to go over here. 15 is it? Let's see. No, that's that. When he comes to go and it's in chapter 16, I think. When Shaul comes to anoint David as king, does it say who they are? No, I think he's related to Yishai. That's what I think it is. Yeah. This is when you need a computer mind. Is what you really need. Anyway, I don't want to waste more time looking for it. Not wasting, but we'll look it up again. But the reason why these men are mentioned is because they're going to play a role in this story, but they're also for future reasons as well. We're going to see that the Tzeruya boys, Yoav ben Tzeruya and Abishai ben Tzeruya, share a very interesting character trait, which is they're very, very heated, very intense. And you're going to see that come out with Abishai, and we see it come out later with Yoav as well. And in contrast to David, who also has a tendency to be hot sometimes, but has the ability to restrain himself much quicker than a lot of other people. And we've noted time and again that that's David's really superpower. That's what makes him unique from everybody else. Most other people, once they get hot and intense, they have a very hard time pulling back. David, his restraint has been really key for him. We'll see that come out in this chapter as well. So Abishai says to David, I will go down. I saw an interesting comment by Rabbi Non Bazak, who quotes a rabbi by the name of Rav Amos Hacham, who says that Achimelech HaHiti may be Uriah HaHiti, may be the same person as Uriah HaHiti, the husband of Bathsheba. And Bathsheba will be the one who David will get into a big debacle with in Shemuel Bet. So he tries to connect the dots and say that Achimelech HaHiti is a nickname for Uriah HaHiti, which is interesting because here Uriah does not want to take the lead with David, go into harm's way, and later David will put him in harm's way to die so that he can take Bathsheba, his wife, right? So just that whole interesting dynamic over here, starting with here and then carrying over into Shemuel Bet, is just something interesting to behold. I'll read to you Rav Bazak's words over here. He says, what's the connection between the story of Uriah HaHiti here, if we assume it's the same person, and him in Shemuel Bet? He says, B'mabat le'achor, in retrospect, nitan lomar, we can say, ki al av shepirkeno mehaveh tikun leperek Kaf Dalet, even though our chapter serves as a fixing for chapter 24, as we shall soon see, adayin en tikun shameh. Fixing is not totally complete. Another issue sort of rises up. Not everybody saw that David was fully peaceful over here. In other words, why doesn't Achimelech go with him as opposed to Avishai? Achimelech is uncomfortable with whatever he thinks David might do. He's nervous that David will commit an act of aggression here against Shaul. David has not made his plans known to what he's going to do. He just tells Avishai and Achimelech, who's coming with me to Shaul's camp? What are you going to do? Are you going to kill him? What are you going to do with him? It seems like David is plotting something of aggressiveness towards Shaul, and Achimelech, who we're claiming is Uriah, does not want to be a part of it because he still doesn't know his intentions. He doesn't know David is really for Shaul. So he says, therefore, David. We will see that this chapter will not paint David in a critical light, quite the opposite. But in retrospect, seeing as what David does later with Uriah HaHiti, when we learn the story of Bathsheba and Uriah HaHiti, assuming they're the same person, we ask ourselves, how could it be that David reached such a level to literally kill Uriah HaHiti? I shouldn't say literally, but basically not literally, but set him up to die. It's kiviyachol that he killed him. It's possible to look back and say that maybe our chapter, this one, was the seed which David eventually was plotting to kill Uriah. It's clear that we have a problem here. David did not make it clear to everybody that he was going without the intention of harming Shaul. They think he's going to harm him. So it's not clear that David is peaceful, and maybe something inside of him was going to potentially be aggressive. And so we see the seeds of aggression in David and in this story with Uriah, and Uriah doesn't want to be a part of it, and eventually that seed of aggression will blossom into David being aggressive towards Uriah. And so maybe that's a little bit of the hint of what's going on. It might be reading a little bit too much into it, but yeah, some of these chapters are going to give us the seed where David ends up going wrong. Yeah. Something to think about. It's not guaranteed. I did not read, when I read this chapter the first time, Uriah's name did not come into my mind. I did not think, oh, this is definitely Uriah HaChiti. Obviously, the Chiti part of it sounds compelling, but Achimelech HaChiti, Uriah HaChiti, I'm not so sure that I would make that connection. Yeah, big guy in his army, and that's what happens as well. Yeah, he says, so yeah, that's also the connection. The Chiti connection is there. So it's an interesting theory, and it would help us to explain a little bit later where David's seeds of aggression stem from, but I don't know that you're compelled to say it that way. Anyway, let's go to verse 7. Let's come back to our chapter. So David offers Achimelech and Avishai to come with him to the camp of Shaul. Avishai agrees. Vayomed David va'Avishai el ha'am laila. Vayavo. David and Avishai come el ha'am towards the camp of Shaul at night. V'hineh Shaul shochev yashen ma'agal. Shaul sleeping in the circle. And his spear is stuck in the ground by his head. And Avner and the rest of the people are lying beside Shaul. So once again, David is in a very similar situation to what we saw in chapter 24. Just like in chapter 24, although this time David doesn't have all his men accompanying him, right? This time it's just David and Abishai, the two of them together. But David is once the weapon right in front of him. David can easily kill Shaul without any consequences and leave, right? And let's see what happens now. Yes? Very similar situation. Now, it's funny because we always say that when a person finds themselves in exactly the same situation, it's an opportunity to do teshuvah, right? So David was in that situation once before, and he cut the coat of Shaul, and he regretted that. Let's see what he does in this situation to potentially repair what he did in chapter 24. Vayomer Avishai el David. Avishai says to David, Star Elohim hayom et oyivcha yadecha. He says, great, God has delivered your enemy into your hands today. Right? Sound familiar? It's exactly what the men told him in the cave that day. Right? Says Avishai, now give me permission. Let me drive the spear into the ground, obviously kill him, in one shot. I will not have to strike him twice. He's going to do it in a powerful way, one time. Vayomed David el Avishai al tashchitenu. David says to Yishai, do not do him any violence. For who can lay their hand on the anointed one of God and be cleansed and be forgiven for such an act? So here, before anything is done, David already goes back to what he said in chapter 24. He continuously calls Shaul Mashiach Hashem, the anointed one of God. And right off the bat, he discourages Avishai from laying a finger on Shaul, doing anything wrong. Who can lay a hand to the anointed one of God and be cleansed and be forgiven? Very good. So why did he come down there in the first place? Well, let's read the rest of the story. But notice over here, there's no cutting of coat. There's none of that. Also, there's a slight difference here because in the cave story, chapter 24, David's men encouraged David to be the one to approach Shaul and kill him, right? They say, you go do it. Here, Avishai volunteers himself to go do it, which maybe that would have given David a little bit more leeway. I didn't tell him what to do. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. Avishai did it on his own, right? And David goes out of his way to stop it. Verse 10, Vayomed David cha Adonai ki Adonai yigofenu. David says, I swear by the Lord's name as the Lord lives, for God himself will strike him down. Or yomo yavo vamet, or his day will come and he will die of natural causes. Or b'milchama yered v'nispa, or he will go into battle and he will perish in battle. In other words, David says, this is not going to happen on my hand. I will not be held responsible for it. Either God will send him, will kill him, or his day will come or he'll die in battle, which is what ends up happening for Shaul, but it's not going to be me. Verse 11, Chalil ali me Adonai misheloach yadi b'mshiach Adonai. It is a chilul, heaven forbid, in God's name, for me to stretch my hand towards the anointed one of God. Ve'ata kahna et ha'hanit asher mera'ashotav ve'et sapahat hamayim min al-chalani. He says, let us just take the spear and the water jar at his head and we will be off. So they take the jug of water and the spear and they leave. Now that's a little different than cutting the coat. Cutting the coat is to stretch their hand and in an aggressive way at Shaul. This is, they take the spear and the water jug because David wants it as proof, once again, that he had the opportunity to kill Shaul, but he didn't, because he's going to make another impassioned speech, just as he did in chapter 24, telling Shaul, back off, you have no reason to come ahead and attack me. So David does, Vayikach David et hachanit ve'et sapachat hamayim mera'ashot Shaul. David takes the spear, the jug of water from the head of Shaul, vayalchu lahem, and Avishai and David leave the camp. Ve'en ro'eh, ve'en yodea, ve'en mekitz. No one saw, no one knew, no one woke up. Ki kulam yeshenim, for all of them were quiet, they were all sleeping. Why would they, how could they sleep through such a, I don't know if it was chaos, but how could it be that nobody would watch, nobody felt David's presence, Avishai's presence? Like, how could it be? Because a heavenly slumber was placed upon them by God, and that's why they remained asleep. So two very interesting things I just want to point out. Very subtle. You might not notice it when you first read it. I didn't until Rav Bazak pointed it out to me. But notice how David is speaking to Avishai, and he says, heaven forbid, in verse 11, he says, heaven forbid me taking reaching my hand to that. He tells him, Kachna, you take the spear and the jug of water and let's go. And then what does the next pasuk say? David took the spear and the jug of water. Avishai didn't take it despite David's command. What do you think happened? Why wouldn't Avishai take it? Doesn't seem there's anything wrong with taking it. So afraid, fear, it doesn't seem like Avishai is very afraid. In fact, he's the one he wants, I think the opposite. I think Avishai is showing displeasure with David not killing Shaul here. David is telling him, take the spear and the jug and let's get out of here. We're not going to kill Shaul. And Avishai says, I'm not happy with that decision. This is Avishai's way of protesting David's decision not to kill Shaul. Avishai, as we said, this is where his hot-temperedness comes in. He says, let me kill him. He wants to go. You could see Avishai is very anxious to avenge David's honor, right? And so he says, I'll go. He wants to be the one to hit him. And David's like, hold your horses. We're not doing any of that. This is Mashiach Hashem. We just came down here to prove a point, taking the spear and the jug, and we're going. Let's go. Great. And you can imagine almost Avishai folding his hands in front of David saying, I don't want to do that. He's not happy with the plan. He's not taking those orders from David because he feels David is being silly to not go and attack Shaul when he has the opportunity. And so maybe that's the subtle way of the Tanakh telling us that Avishai protested. But nevertheless, David was adamant about not stretching his hand towards the Mashiach Hashem. And therefore, David takes it and he leaves. And at the end of verse 12, we see that the Tanakh tells us the stamp of approval that David received. Because what does it tell us? Nobody woke up and nobody was awakened from their slumber because God placed a heavenly slumber upon them. What does that show? God intervened in this situation. God helped. He assisted David because David made the decision not to kill Shaul, right? Maybe God was testing him to see what you would do knowing, right, they have to be asleep. It could be. So it could be that the slumber was there to test them to make sure that, because David knew he could have gotten away with it, it wouldn't have been a problem. I like to think that unlike chapter 24, because in chapter 24, when David has the opportunity, God doesn't make an appearance. God doesn't do anything. In this story, God makes an appearance. And I think God does make an appearance in this sort of side way to show that he's happier with what David did in this chapter than what David did in the previous chapter in 24, which is that David showed an extra level of restraint. He never had a plan for aggression, unlike what happened in chapter 24. And as a result, David is seeing the divine assistance in what's happening over here as a stamp of approval for David's actions. Let's continue reading in verse 13. David crossed over the other side. And he stands afar on the top of the hill, with a considerable distance between them, because he knows he cannot be too close to Shaul when he reveals his position. Verse 14. David calls out to the people, and to Avner ben Ner, saying to him as follows: Avner, aren't you going to answer? And Avner calls out and answers, who are you to shout at the king? Verse 15, David responds to Avner, Halo ish ata, you are a man, aren't you? Who is like you amongst Israel? Why didn't you properly guard over your master the king? For one of the members of the nation came to slay the Lord your king. So first thing David does is he goes after Avner. He says, Avner, you were not doing your job properly, right? You were not guarding the king the way you were supposed to. Ironic for the fact that Avner will eventually become the protector of David himself, right? So David gives him a little bit of musar, saying that you did not do your job properly in defending the position of the king. Yeah? David is definitely going a little aggressive at Avner, for sure. He's trying to prove a point. I think they might translate it a little differently in the Sacks. I don't know if they feel like, yeah, they said, won't you answer, Avner? He says, who are you calling out to the king? And David says, you are quite a man, Avner, who is quite like you in all of Israel. It sounds a little bit, the way Rabbi Sacks translates it, it's a little less aggressive. It's a little bit more like, you know, how could you do such a thing? Like, you are such a great person and you have such a heavy responsibility. How could you let this happen, right? Yeah, it could be read both ways. But in the end of the day, he's being critical of Avner and his lack of shmirah of the king. And he says, Lo tov hadavar hazeh. He says, you have not given a good account of yourself. I see that, what you did. As the Lord lives, all of you deserve to die for your lack of loyalty to the king. That you did not guard and protect your master, the anointed one of God. Look around and see, where is the spear of the king? Where is his jug of water, which is by his head? And so he says, look, I was the one who was there. Verse 17, Shaul apparently is alerted now to the screaming. He recognizes the voice. Shaul, it's called David. Shaul recognizes David's voice. He says, is that your voice, my son David? It's almost as if, yes, very similar thing when David referred to him as my father, and now it was his father-in-law, and he's saying something similar. So despite the fact that Shaul and his men were camped to search for David, all of a sudden hearing the voice of David once again triggers Shaul back into this nice guy kind of status. David says, "It is my voice, the Lord your king." Right? He just says it's me. Right? It's like those people who call on the telephone call and you pick up and it's like, hey, it's me. Right? You should know who it is. Right? It's almost like David, his voice is so recognizable to Shaul. He says it's me, and Shaul recognizes who it is. Esther, you had a question?
Yes, I was reading the commentaries in the book that I have regarding taking the jug of water and the spear. And it says that at first, David told him to take the spear and the jug of water, but then changed his mind because he was afraid that he would use the spear to kill Shaul and not listen to what he had told him.
She's saying here, though.
She's saying, like, he doesn't take the spear, maybe he'll, like, if he lets him pick up the spear.
He didn't want to. Esther, he's saying he didn't want to let Avishai pick up the spear because he was nervous that he couldn't control him at that point.
Right.
So that's good. In other words, at first he said you take it, and then he reconsidered that because given again, which illustrates again Abishai's aggressiveness, that he was nervous that Abishai wouldn't follow suit through with the command not to strike David. That's also potential, not too far off from the way we explained it as almost like an idea of protest, that he didn't want to take it because he would still be suspected of killing Shaul. So let's see how Shaul now reacts to the fact that David is calling to him in verse 18. Shaul says, sorry, David is the speaker. He says, but why does my Lord continue to pursue his servant? What have I done, and what evil have I wrong am I guilty of? Again, similar claims on the part of David from chapter 24. He says, please, let my master the king hear the words of his servant. He says, if the Lord has incited you against me, let him be appeased by an offering. But if it is men, may they be accursed of the Lord. In other words, David says, if this is something that's coming upon you because of God, in other words, it's not something you're in control of, God has put this idea in your head to come and attack me, then I bring an offering to Hashem, let Hashem be appeased by the offering and stop this from continuing. It's obviously in Hashem's hands. He says, but if it's human beings who are enticing you to come and chase after me, let them be cursed. Why? For they have driven me out today so that I cannot have a share in the Lord's possession. As if telling me, go and worship other gods. Very interesting. David is saying that all of this chasing of me has forced me out of the land of Israel. David has had to flee over and over again from territory to territory, to the point where he's actually going to have to leave the boundaries, the borders of Eretz Yisrael. That's what he's going to do at the beginning of next chapter. Beginning of next chapter, he's going to go again to the land of the Philistine, which is outside the proper boundaries of the land of Israel. David is saying all of this chasing after me has driven me away from having a share in God's possessions, which could mean having a share in what is rightfully mine to be the king, or it could mean more likely that I'm no longer living in Israel. I had to leave from in front of Hashem because of all of this chasing and all the fact that I'm such a refugee, which is equivalent in his mind to telling me, Lech avod Elohim ha'chayim. It's as if you're telling me, go worship other gods. There's nothing here for you. Shaul chasing David time and again and kicking him out of Eretz Yisrael basically is his way of saying to David, you have no part of this. Get out of here. Lech avod Elohim ha'chayim. Does David pray for Hashem for what? Right. Yeah. It's the first time that it's recorded in that way. Exactly. Yeah, I definitely think. So what he's suggesting that should have realized it. I think that my view of it would be that the book of Shemuel is a narrative book. It's narration. So it's true that we do have instances of prayer, but the author here is more interested in the actions of the individuals, not so much their prayer to Hashem. But we do see in Tehillim, Yeah, definitely think when you read Tehillim parallel to the book of Shemuel, and you see there's a paragraph of Tehillim where he talks about he's in Nov when he's running away from Shaul. There's a whole paragraph of Tehillim just devoted to what David said when he was in the cave together with Shaul, and when Zifim told him, David stater imanu. So if you look at the book of Tehillim, that's where you get David's innermost thoughts and prayers as he's going through this situation chapter by chapter. Here, we're getting more David's actions, how he's relating to Shaul. And yes, he does throw a little hint over to the idea that Hashem should help this conflict come to an end and be resolved. I want to just take a moment on this point of David saying that being kicked out of Eretz Yisrael is tantamount to them saying to him, you have no portion in God's land, and therefore it's like you have to worship idols. I toggled over here to a Gemara in Masechet Ketubot, Daf Kof Amud, page 110b. In Gemara, it uses David's words to teach the following idea about the land of Israel. So, Liz, you're going to Israel next week, inshallah, Be'ezat Hashem. So you'll be very happy with the following, or somewhat, with the following teaching. Yes, you have to stay there, unfortunately. Unfortunately, I should say. So the rabbis teach the following. I'll read it to you and translate. It's very straightforward language. The rabbis taught in a baita. Always a person should make every attempt to live in the land of Israel. Even if it means living in a city which is majority Gentile. He should not live outside the land of Israel. Even in a city which is majority Jewish. Anybody who lives in the land of Israel is tantamount, is equivalent, is likened to somebody who has a God. Anybody who lives outside the land of Israel is equivalent to somebody who has no God. As the pasuk says, God says, I will give you the land of Canaan for me to be a God for you, which seems as though God, our choice of having God as our God is dependent on our receiving of the land of Canaan. They continue. Anybody who does not live in the land and does not have a God. The Gemara asks a question. Well, anybody who doesn't live in the land of Israel has no God? Like, that's a little bit extreme. What do you mean? We're all sitting here in America. We worship God all the time. We have shuls, we have schools, we have Torah. He says, no. It's to tell you, it's anybody who lives outside of Israel. It's as if they are idolatrous. As is told by David himself. You have kicked me out this day from having a share in the portion of God, as if to say, Lech avod Elohim achim. Says the Gemara, who told David to go worship other idols? Nobody did, nor did he. To teach you, anybody who lives outside of Eretz Yisrael is tantamount to worshiping idols. This is heavy-duty statements on the part of the rabbi, which might not sit so comfortably with us here in America. Look, I include myself in. I don't have a problem reading this Gemara to classes because I'm with you. I'm in the same boat. By the way, just as a little zinger for us, right? It says that you should live in Israel, even if it means being around Gentiles, as opposed to living in outside Israel, and if it means living around Jews. That's certainly the case. It goes without saying that it's better to live in Israel amongst non-Syrian people than to live in the Syrian community, right? So if the reason why it's saying, well, I have my community here, this is why my people are here, unfortunately is not going to be a claim that God is going to accept upon us from us, when it happens. So, okay, we have what to do. We have what to achieve. And I think there's a very powerful idea over here. What does that really mean, that somebody who lives outside of Eretz Israel is like somebody who worshipped idols? Why? That seems very unfair, very harsh. None of us are worshiping idols. We have some Torah institutions that might be better than some things that are going on in Eretz Israel. So why do they make that statement? It's in Talmud Bavli, so it is. The Beraita over here could potentially, there's no name attached to the Beraita, so it's not clear who's saying it. Actually, my guess would be probably it's about somebody who's in Israel, because it's in Hebrew, it's not in Aramaic, and the Beraitot were by the Tanaim who largely lived in Israel. That's not impossible, but I'd say it's Israel, but we don't have 100%. I don't know if I could say guarantee. Correct. Maybe there's a motivation here to get them, and certainly this could be a motivation for us as well. Yeah, it could work as well. But I think it's a little bit deeper than that. I think the idea is that when you understand, and we all know that the land of Israel, the presence of God is more palpable in the land of Israel. God's divine intervention is stronger in the land of Israel than it is anywhere else. So when one makes the decision not to live in Israel, but to live outside Israel, what we're essentially deciding, without saying it, is we want to live with less divine intervention. We know that living in Israel provides us a closer relationship with God, that God will have a more defined role in our lives. We're saying, I don't want that. I'd rather live outside of the land of Israel in a more removed divine providence situation, which that switch is tantamount to Avodah Zarah, because we're basically saying we don't want to live with this intensity of divine providence. Now, Jews, since the beginning of time, have had trouble living in Eretz Israel, right? Reuven, Gad, and Menashe didn't want to live in Eretz Israel. They wanted to be on the Jordan. The Jews didn't come back from Bavel when the Beit HaMikdash was rebuilt in the time of Ezra, and so on and so forth, all the way to us, right? So the relationship between Jews and Eretz Israel, the Meraglim, didn't want to go to Eretz Israel. The relationship between Am Yisrael and Eretz Israel has been a tenuous one throughout our history. Maybe we don't care to admit that, but we've always had some tension with the idea that we have to live in one land, right? That we have to live in Israel. It's always been a source of difficulty for us. And I think part of that difficulty is the intensity of living in the spotlight of God. It's very hard to live in the spotlight of God. And sometimes we unconsciously would rather live less in the spotlight of God, which obligates us less, doesn't put responsibility as much on us, than living in Israel where the spotlight of God is much there. We don't want to have the stage. It's kind of the way I think about it. And that is a little bit of an element of Avodah Zarah-esque when you think about the providence that we want to share with God. And David here is lamenting the fact that Shaul is chasing him out of the land of Israel because David desperately wants to have that divine providence. He wants that divine intervention in his life, which he believes he needs to have inside of the land of Israel. So I think it's interesting what David says and what the rabbis take away from it. It's definitely a powerful lesson for us. It might not sit so well, it might live a little bit in our stomach, but it's something for us to contemplate and think about. We have to be honest with ourselves about it. Yeah. Let's continue on. Let's wrap up this chapter. We're up to verse 20, Pasuk Kaf. David continues his monologue towards Shaul. He says, Ve'ata al yipol dami arza. He says, please now, do not let my blood fall to the ground, meaning do not kill me. Mineged pene Adonai, away from the presence of God. Ki yatsa mech Yisrael levakesh et paraosh echad. For the king of Israel has come to search for a single flea. Ka'asher, flea as in F-L-E-A, like a bug. Ka'asher yirdof hakore beharim, as if he were hunting a partridge in the hills. In other words, this is a similar sentiment we shared in verse 20 in chapter 24, when he calls himself a flea. He's saying, like, why do you care about me? Why are you so obsessed with me? Why are you coming after me? I'm nothing. I'm a nobody. Yeah. Why? He's going to be king, but at the moment now, yeah, the potential king maybe not, but David is not interested in exposing. He's not threatening Shaul. If anything, Shaul's chasing after David is only giving people more and more, only giving David more and more exposure of the fact that he is going to take over as king. It's doing the opposite. David could have just laid low. Shaul could have ignored him, and David would have just let it happen, right? And nothing would have been. The fact that Shaul's giving him all this attention by chasing after him is bringing to light what Shaul doesn't want to be brought to light. So David is saying in a humble way, just leave me alone and let's let this situation kind of ride out. Verse 21, Shaul once again, as in chapter 24, is contrite. Yomer Shaul chatati. Shaul says, I have sinned. And it's ironic that Shaul would say this, right? Because we've noted in earlier chapters that his struggle, his main challenge was admitting that he sinned. This is where he struggled with the story of the Philistine, and then he struggled with Amalek, admitting that he sinned. And twice in 2 chapters, he finally admits, Chatati, Shuv beni David, come back, David, my son. I will not do any more harm to you or attempt to do harm to you. Seeing as how you held my life precious in your eyes on this day, meaning knowing that you could have killed me and you decided to spare my life. I have been foolish, and I have erred so very much. So once again, we see an admission of guilt on the part of Shaul, not dodging it, and he admits to his wrongdoing. David responds and says, he says, behold, here is your majesty's spear. Let one of the young men come over and get it. Very interesting. So David is going to return the spear to Shaul. So unlike the cutting of the coat, which never comes back to Shaul, the spear, he returns to him. And the Lord will requite every man for his right conduct and loyalty. He says, for this day, Hashem delivered you into my hands, but I will not have it. To raise my hand upon the anointed one of God. Verse 24, and just as I valued your life highly on this day, so may God value my life, and he should rescue me from all my troubles. David already is anticipating the fact that this is not the last of his troubles. He's already talking about God sparing him, not just from this, but also from all other future sufferings that he may encounter, and there will be many of them. So David ends off with a subtle prayer, saying that in payments, midah keneged midah, for sparing Shaul's life and treating it preciously, Hashem should protect his life and treat it that way as well. The final pasuk of this chapter, though, once again, although the reader might be expecting maybe now is the time that David and Shaul can finally come together. It didn't happen in chapter 24. Maybe now, after the same encounter in chapter 26, he could come back. Shaul el David. Shaul says to David in verse 25, Baruch atah beni David. Blessed are you, my son David. Gam asot ta'aseh v'gam chol tuchal. You shall achieve and you shall prevail. David goes on his path. Shaul shav lemkomo, and Shaul returns home. Once again, they cannot live together or coexist side by side, but they could at least tolerate each other. They split up and go in their different directions. And this will be the last time that Shaul and David encounter each other face to face, this type of scenario. So it's a little bit of a better reconciliation than maybe chapter 24, but ultimately still leaves us with the same feeling in the end that David and Shaul must go their separate ways.
Is there any difference in terms other than he says spectacular?
In chapter 24, he says, you're more righteous than me. Exactly. Not quite the same. Maybe this is a little bit on a different level. Yeah. David is very contrite after Bathsheba when Natan gives it to him. That's David's hallmark. He does not somebody who stands on ceremony and holds on to his actions. He's very quick to admit and to apologize. Yeah. I want to read to you just one small excerpt from Rabbi Bazak's wrap-up of this chapter, because we have to go back to the question we asked at the very beginning. Given how similar this chapter is, chapter 26 to chapter 24, with a couple of slight differences here and there, you wonder why this chapter even needs to be here. In the end of the day, we're back to the same square we started from, back to square one, as they say. It's exactly the same situation. David has an opportunity to kill Shaul. He holds himself back. He makes his speech. Shaul admits. They separate ways. All of the elements seem to be the same. We did note that David does a little bit better this time by not cutting the coat. He makes his demands known to his men a little bit earlier, right? Unlike we said, maybe in chapter 24, David wanted to be aggressive, and only after he saw the men going after him, he told them not to. Here, he's clear with Abishai not to go after him. So David definitely exercises the same, if not more, restraint, and also restrains his other people a little bit quicker. But the subtleties are very, very, very small. And one wonders why this whole chapter needs to be here. So I'll read to you a little bit of what Rabbi Nod brings, and he brings it based on Midrash and Tehillim. This will close. He says, Ka'amur, hakbalot elo, as we said, these parallels between chapters 24 and 26, me'orerot tmiha, arouse the obvious question, al hatzorech be'te'ur hakaful, on the necessary, on the necessariness, I don't know if that's the word, on the necessity, thank you, on the necessity of having this double chapter. The Midrash attempts to explain why there was a double story here. And it's mevusas on the kudash she'eno mofia b'pshuto shel mikra, but it's based on something that we don't see in the pshat. It's not the direct understanding of the text. So what does the Midrash say? It says, "Kevan shehalach Shaul." After chapter 24, after David convinced Shaul he wasn't coming after him, and Shaul agreed, and they reconciled, and then they split ways. Amru lo giborav. Many of Shaul's men came to him and stoked the flames again. He said, why do you think David is such a righteous guy because he killed him in the cave? He wasn't doing it because he was being righteous. He did it for other reasons. He knows, David knows, this is what Shaul's men are saying to him, that if he would have touched you with that one, if he would have done anything, we would have gone and chased after him and killed him in 1 minute. He saw us and he got scared. He says that the men tell Shaul that he wasn't doing it because he was righteous. He was doing it because he was scared of us. So he saw us there and he got it. When Shaul heard that, he said, right, he tricked me. So Shaul begins again his pursuit of David. And that's what David says. That's why David goes after Avner. It helps us to explain. You were kind of questioning, like, why is he going after Avner so hard, right? He says, this is why he went after Avner, because Avner was the one who stoked the flame for Shaul to come back at him again as his general. So he said to Avner, what do you have to say for yourself, Avner? Like, you were the one who did this, right? It's your fault. Amarlo. And David said to him, now what are you going to say? You told a lie to Shaul the last time that I didn't kill him because I was scared of you. Now what are you going to say? I'm not scared of you. This situation was not scared. I went right into the heart of your camp, went right up to your king and was ready to kill him. I didn't care about anything about what you guys did. You said yesterday to Shaul about the incident in the cave, that if I would have done anything to you, you would have killed me. Yeah, here's my spear and my thing. Now who had the chance to kill? Now what are you going to say? What claim can you make against me now? What could you possibly say? And Avner had nothing. He couldn't say anything back to David. Notice how Avner makes no statement. He's quiet. He takes the criticism. He was like mute, but he still did not admit to David's righteousness. Avner still kept quiet. So the Midrash says that the point of these two chapters, the repetition of this chapter, is to once again show and emphasize David's righteousness, that if there was any doubt, as there seemed to have been by Shaul's people, who enticed him to come and get David again, because the Me'arah situation was slightly different than this, that's all gone out the window. Right? Because David had the chance, had the opportunity, had nothing to be afraid of, and still didn't go ahead and do it, and nobody has anything to say against him. He says, Al Pi HaMidrash, based on the Midrash, after the first incident, the people claimed against David, right? And that's why Shaul chased him. But in the second time, where David was successful to take the spear and the jug of water, the heart of the camp of Shaul, without anybody knowing, nothing you can make a claim against David. But then Rabbi Bazak brings a different point. And he says, okay, but there's another thing here. Let's note the order of the chapters. What took place between chapter 24 and chapter 26? Navi puts in chapter 25, the story of Naval and Abigail, right? Why is that story right in between? The story could have easily gone straight from 24 to 26 and illustrated the point of the Midrash. Why stick in chapter 25 right in the middle with the story of Abigail? What happened? What did that do to transform David? Exactly. And he learns from Abigail how to have that extra level of restraint. That's really what it is, right? In chapter 24, David restrained himself, but not to the fullest extent that he could have, right? In chapter 25, he sees the righteousness of Abigail and how she brings the restraint upon him and how her righteousness is able to save David from a catastrophic mistake. And David recognizes that he needs help in this area, that he needs someone like Abigail. And Abigail stays on with him, and you could almost imagine her training David and working with David, and David using her as a way to harness this quality in which he has, right? So he says, if we go deep into it, the parallelism of these stories, he says, he says the hevdel shu asiba lahabatam zeh tzedeh amanu alav shibud kavda the kishlon mesiyam shel David, weakness of David, that he does not, he's a little too aggressive, doesn't rebuke his men until after they're about to go ahead and kill them, right? They want to go ahead and kill Shaul. He says, Kana mifgash eno mikri kefi shaya perek haftadah hu yazum biyad David. He says, but here it wasn't a haphazard encounter. Notice how in chapter 24, the encounter between Shaul and David happens on its own. David wasn't prepared for it. And maybe that's why he didn't make the best decision that he could have. Here, David initiates. He goes aggressively to initiate the situation. And Avishai says, you don't do it. Let me do it. I'll go ahead and kill him. But David rejects this right away. So in chapter 24, David, in chapter 24, he cuts the coat, which ended up being a problem. But in chapter 25, he just takes the spear, doesn't do anything, he doesn't touch Shaul. He says, it's possible that the taking of the spear, it's that same spear that Shaul hurled twice at David to try and kill him. And then he returns it to it. Coming in Shaul in a soft way. Shaul, this thing has no value to you. You can take the spear back. What kind of person returns the weapon to his enemy? When you return the weapon to your enemy, what's David saying? I'm not afraid of this. It's not going to do anything. Right? You've tried to kill me with multiple times before. You may try to do it again. I'm not afraid of it. It's not, nothing's going to do. And he's basically telling you, I'm not afraid. Right? In the end of the story, David stands before Shaul with no sword, with no spear, and no weapon. When have we seen that before? David stands against his enemy with no spear, with Goliath. But what does he stand?
Goliath.
In the name of Hashem. Yeah, in Goliath. He stands with the name of Hashem, right? We come out that chapter 26 is not the same as chapter 24, despite all of the similar elements and parallels. Nahafochu, he says it's the opposite. Chapter 26 is a tikkun, is a reparation on the part of David for his actions in chapter 24. David corrects his error. David goes back to prove once again his righteousness to Shaul, without any giving of a reason for someone to challenge him on this point. Right? And that's why God helps him in the story. I don't think that is a coincidence, though, that it happened after the story of Shaul. That's what he writes here, and I'll close with this. He says, what caused this change, this development in David? It didn't just happen at the finger. He says, you know what? It's one word, Abigail. In chapter 25, he says, we saw how she was successful to stop him from killing Nabal. And her influence, her blessed influence in righteousness is recognizable here in the story. It's not a coincidence that chapter 25 comes in between 24 and 26, which helps to develop David's restraint, right? He says, he says there's also similar language between the two of them. What happens? Does God say? What does David say is going to happen to Shaul? He says either God will take him, or his day will come, or he'll die in battle. Where did David learn that God will take the person if he's the enemy of David? That's what happened to Naval, right? 10 days after the encounter with Naval and the whole situation, Naval dies, and David is justified, right? And David blesses Hashem for what he did. That story taught David, you don't have to always take matters into your own hands. You don't always have to be the one. God will take care of it. And that's what David sets up again. And by the end of the story, he says, we're not going to touch Shaul. Just like God did it with Naval, he'll take care of Shaul when God is ready. It's not going to be me who's going to do it. So that story teaches David that sense of restraint, that sense of trust in Hashem. He doesn't always have to be the one to do it, and that God is going to come to his aid and take care of him and protect him. That's why the pasuk uses the same word, vayigof. Here it says, God will be yudgofenu. God will put him to death. The same way, vayigof Hashem et Naval, God put Naval to death. So while 24 and 26 seem very similar, and they are very similar, the subtle difference makes all the difference in the world. As having pivoted from chapter 25, David is growing And that's the best part of David. You see him growing. You see him recognizing his mistakes, subtle as they may be. He learns from everyone and everything. And he re-engages in those same scenarios and corrects them, fixes them in later situations. We've seen this time and again. The hallmark of David makes him such a relatable character, and this is what the seeds of monarchy are about. Because to be a king, you have to be able to learn from your mistakes, to have to be able to learn from your experiences, and that's a quality David has, and that's why he's suited to be the king. Questions, comments, or thoughts before we sign off? Okay. That concludes chapter 26. We'll be G'zat Hashem continue. We only have a couple more chapters left to finish Shemuel Aleph, and then we move into Shemuel Bet as we get deeper and deeper into the narratives of David HaMelech.